today I'm going to talk about literature in the Cold War era and how they culturally affect each other. So first I'm going to introduce the topic by explaining a little bit about the Cold War, which you probably already know. But the Cold War era was marked by political tension, economic competition, arms races, counterculture, popular anxiety, and civil wars in both Korea and Vietnam, and also other places of the world. Such events largely influenced the cultural arena of the era, and I'm going to focus in literature, specifically American literature. Basically, what I want to show is that literature and like the relationship between literature and the Cold War and the Cold War era is that it's a cause and effect cycle where something that happens in the Cold War era has made this person want to write a book about it, and then maybe this book influences, for example, counter culture movements. So first, let's talk about Cold War literature at a glance. The literature in the Cold War era was marked by specifically fiction and cloak and dagger novels, which are basically police novels and thrillers about spies. A lot of the novels revolved over nuclear themes. One of the remarkable books that occurred a little bit before the nuclear climax of the Cold War happened, which is The Lord of the Flies. It is a book about British young men that are evacuating due to nuclear war, and they crash on an island, and their society kind of ends up being chaos and destroyed. And what happened is that the public that was reading this during the Cold War era was scared that it was actually how it was going to end if the things continued like this. Then there was also other novels that I can mention right now. For example, Hunt of the Red October, which is a tale about a renegade Soviet sub being hunted by the US Navy. And this is really interesting because Ronald Reagan actually made it popular. He was a US ex-president, and yes. And then there's another one which obviously there were counterculture movements, right? And Catcher in the Rye was an excellent book to portray this counter movement situation because it portrayed rebellion against the era's conventionalism, which inspired a lot of young people. I'm going to talk about satire and criticism of American Cold War culture, and basically it's just to say that a lot of works not only resonated and talked about nuclear destruction, there were also other topics that people wanted to talk about, such as the Vietnam War, civil rights, and so on, and also the causes that led to this nuclear mess. First, I mentioned Kurt Vonnegut's Cat Cradle, which is an American classic that satirizes the arms races that happened in the Cold War, and basically makes fun of scientists that don't know the consequences of the inventions that they create. And then another major work that I really wanted to talk about was Catch-22, which is written in 1961, which wasn't necessarily set in the Cold War, but the book is set in World War II, but the author said himself that it actually alludes to the Cold War in the 1950s, and the author criticisms resonated with the college youth in the 1960s because he mocked heroic ideals, portraying them as a manipulative rhetoric from the US government, and he condemned mass organizations and treated the army as a system for killing its own men due to the country's own pride, because as we know, a lot of wars could have ended a lot sooner, but the governments didn't want to because of their pride, because they knew they were going to lose, but they didn't know what to do about it. So this novel in specific, Catch-22, really inspired a generation of young people in counterculture, and they used it as a reference a lot of the times. And lastly, I'm going to talk about McCarthyism and American literature. McCarthyism is a term that describes the action of making accusations of treason without proper evidence, and this marked a lot the Cold War era because the hysteria of communists was very real and very common. There was actually a House of Representatives Committee on American Activities, which condemned people that were alleged communists. And obviously, since it was prevalent, there was obviously some works of literature that alluded to it. One of the main ones is the play The Crucible by Arthur Miller, which is set in the 1600s, so long before the Cold War, for the Salem witch trials. And what the author wants to allude is that in the witch trials, women were persecuted and accused of being witches without really enough evidence, and this is what was happening in the 50s with communists. And actually Miller, by writing this book, he got questioned and he got condemned because he wasn't willing to talk about other people that were in meetings with him. And then another important piece of literature that has to do with McCarthyism is The Manchurian Candidate, where it discusses that if McCarthyists were accusing so many people of being communist agents, it could only divert attention from the real communists. So this gave another perspective to people to actually argument about why you shouldn't do McCarthyism. And yes, that's basically it. So this is the end of my poster. This shows how historical events affect literature and how literature affected counter movements. And yeah, thanks for listening.